I don't know if I'd still be a Christian if the story of Jacob's wrestling match wasn't in the Bible. I'm indebted to it because Jacob's story has helped me to hang on as a Christian. It's given me permission to bring my whole self before God, to engage with God in all kinds of ways. Jacob is returning to the place of his birth after 20 years away and steeling himself to reunite with Esau, the brother whose life he ruined through deceit and manipulation. Jacob has no idea how Esau will receive him, and he's afraid. After sending his family and all his possessions across the river, Jacob decides to spend the night alone. We aren't told why. Maybe he wants to pray and beg God for help. Maybe he wants to scheme and strategize for a while before facing Esau. Maybe he's overwhelmed by anxiety and wishes to hide. Or maybe he's a coward who needs his family to run into Esau first and smooth things over for him. All we know is that Jacob is isolated and vulnerable in a way he hasn't been for a long time. On this night, he can't hide behind his wealth or his many servants or his large and complicated family. They're all gone. He's alone in the dark in a desolate place until he's not. Until a nameless, faceless stranger leaps out of nowhere and throws him to the ground. Scholars have debated for years about what's really happening. Is Jacob attacked by robbers? Does he have a panic attack? Is the stranger really Esau in disguise? It doesn't matter, because all of the battles of our lives, the ones with guilt, shame, fear, doubt, grief, or anger, our wrestling matches with family, friends, enemies, community, the church, all of these battles are ultimately battles with and about God. It is with God, in relationship to God, and in God's presence that we fight the fights that bend, break, and remake us. It is in God's company that we face down the demons within and around us. It is God alone who brings us to the ragged edges of our own strength, so that finally we'll surrender and allow ourselves to be embraced. Whether we recognize the stranger as God or not, God is always the one we struggle with. God is always the one who battles with us, not for our detriment, but for our transformation. I was 6, maybe 7, when I first learned Jacob's story in Sunday school. It terrified me. A stranger leaping out of the darkness, a pitched battle that lasted for hours. God in the guise of an angel, or a human being, or a demon, or a something, dislocating Jacob's hip and abandoning him by a river. The whole thing struck me as ominous, the stuff of horror movies and nightmares. What kind of God did such creepy things? Wasn't God supposed to be loving, protective, and safe? Well, no. At least not in the ways I tend to define loving, protective, and safe. The God who goes toe-to-toe with Jacob is not a God whose first priority is our ease and comfort. This isn't a God who maintains a polite distance and makes nice to keep us happy. Jacob's God is wild and mysterious, unpredictable and strange. Jacob's God doesn't hesitate to muck around in the mud for several hours to bring Jacob to his knees. The Hebrew word for wrestle means to get dusty, to get dirty. This is no dainty, breakable God. This is a God of dust, sweat, blood, and tears. A God who is willing to get dirty to lift us up. Jacob's God is not the God I grew up with. As a child and a teenager, I thought of God as terribly fragile, easily offended, easily upset, easily put off. My job as a good little Christian boy was to obey the rules, keep God happy at all costs. One false turn or one impertinent question, and God would shatter like a fine china teacup knocked off a table. What a contrast to the God who spends an entire night by a muddy river duking it out with Jacob. This is a God who wants to engage, a God we can throw ourselves against with the full weight of our thoughts, questions, and feelings, a God who invites our persistence, intensity, and strength. This is a God who doesn't let go. As the night wears on and the stranger sees that Jacob has no intention of giving up, he strikes Jacob on the hip socket, dislocating his hip and causing him to limp. Frederick Buechner describes it like this: "It looks as though a miracle might happen. Jacob is winning. The stranger cries out to be set free before the sun rises. Then, suddenly, all is reversed. He merely touches the hollow of Jacob's thigh, and in a moment Jacob is lying there crippled and helpless. The sense we have," Buechner writes, "which Jacob must have had, that the whole battle was from the beginning fated to end this way, that the stranger had simply held back until now, letting Jacob exert all his strength and almost win, so that when he was defeated, he would know that he was truly defeated, so that he would know all the shrewdness, will, and brute force that he could muster were not enough. Jacob will not release his grip. Only now it is a grip not of violence, but of need, like the grip of a drowning man." We live in a culture that celebrates success, scorns defeat. But sometimes defeat is mercy. Defeat is what saves us. Jacob's wounding is the troubling but rock-solid truth that blessing and bruising are not mutually exclusive in the realm of God. We can limp and prevail at the same time. We can experience healing in brokenness. If I want to engage with God, then I must expect that I'll be changed in the process, and not always in ways that are painless or comfortable or easy. I can't dictate the terms of blessing. I can't say, I want the blessing, but not the limp. Sometimes the blessing is the limp. As dawn breaks, the story tells us the stranger asked Jacob to let go. Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." I love this line because it assures me that sometimes winning involves nothing more than not giving up. Sometimes the spiritual life is about little more than hanging on for dear life to a God who feels mysterious, bewildering, and frightening. Sometimes faith comes down to saying, "There's so much I can't wrap my head around, but I know that there's a blessing in this mess somewhere, so I'm going to hang on until I find it." So Jacob hangs on, waiting for something good to happen, and the stranger consents to his request. But first, he asks Jacob the terrible but essential question upon which blessing is predicated. What is your name? The last time in the story that Jacob is asked this question, he's 20 years younger and standing in his disabled father's tent, wearing his brother's clothes. His father, Isaac, wary and suspicious, is afraid. He senses something. He knows the immense power of blessing, and he doesn't dare bestow it on the wrong person. So he asks once again, who is standing in his tent? And Jacob, whose very name means heel grabber, looks into his father's failing eyes and lies. I am Esau, your firstborn son. 20 years later, the heel grabber gets a do-over. Still groaning in pain, he hears the question leave the stranger's lips. What is your name? Who are you? I wonder if this is a question God asks us too. Not because God doesn't know who we are, but because so often we don't. Or we do, but we don't want to face what we know. What's your name? Who are you? Who are you really? What Jacob learns is that the life-changing questions we dodge and ignore return to us again and again until we find the courage to look them in the eye and answer them honestly. My hunch is that if Jacob had lied to the stranger yet again, the battle would have continued. God would have challenged Jacob's destructive self-deceptions over and over until he finally surrendered to the uncomfortable truth. I'm Jacob. I'm the man who lied to my father, cheated my brother, manipulated my father-in-law, and abandoned every disaster I created. I am Jacob. It's only when we name the worst that we can relinquish it. It's only when we confess the ugliness within and around us that God begins the gracious work of transformation. You shall no longer be called Jacob, says the stranger. You shall be called Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. This moment in the story makes me cringe and laugh. This is the blessing Jacob receives? A new name that essentially guarantees him a lifetime of holy struggle? You shall be called Israel, meaning you shall spend the rest of your limping life wrestling with God. What sort of blessing is that? Not a bad one, actually. Wrestling, as it turns out, is not an irreverent thing, because it's the opposite of apathy, the opposite of resignation, the opposite of quitting. It's even the opposite of loneliness. To fight is to stay close, to keep my arms wrapped tight around my opponent. Fighting means I haven't walked away from God, and God hasn't walked away from me. We both have skin left in the game. It's a challenge and an invitation to those of us who think our relationship with God has to be smooth and pretty all the time. It doesn't. The God of Jacob delights in those who strive with him. The opposite of loving God is not fighting her. The opposite of loving God is not giving enough of a damn to fight. Wrestling is our best protection. Wrestling keeps God relevant in our lives. It keeps God personal and a force to reckon with, rather than a dusty relic we stick on a shelf. I don't bother getting worked up when I don't care. I don't fight with people I'm passionless about. To wrestle with God is to insist that God matters. As the story continues, the sun comes up, and it becomes Jacob's turn to rename the place of his wounding. He calls the muddy wrestling ring Peniel, saying, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. It's important to remember and to name the places where God shows up and contends with us. These places where God meets us in the darkness, where we lose and find our true names, where mystery wrestles us, where we exhaust our own strength and finally collapse into God's, the places that leave us blessed and limping all at once. As Congressman John Lewis's casket crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama last weekend, red rose petals were spread on the pavement, calling to mind the blood he shed there. In March 1965, Lewis and other civil rights activists were beaten by state troopers while marching to secure voting rights for Black Americans. Their work and sacrifice led to the passage a few months later of the Voting Rights Act, a federal law prohibiting race-based voter discrimination. On Monday, while Lewis's body lay in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, a group of senators who serve on the Judiciary Committee sent a letter to Chairman Lindsey Graham asking him to schedule a hearing for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which the committee debated last week. A new Voting Rights Act is necessary because many Americans are still routinely disenfranchised, and the majority of them are, as the letter says, minorities, the elderly, those with disabilities, the poor, and college students. The literacy tests and poll taxes of the 1960s have been replaced with voter ID laws, closures of polling places, and mass purgings of voter rolls, along with the blatant attempt by the Trump administration to disrupt the U.S. Postal Service, which will be vital to providing a safe way to vote. With a national election looming and a pandemic complicating plans for voting, voter suppression efforts have emerged at startling new levels in state and local contexts. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided mechanisms for federal oversight of changes to state and local laws related to voting, including a process called preclearance in jurisdictions with egregious records of race-based voter discrimination. These mechanisms were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. Almost immediately, North Carolina and Texas enacted strict voter ID laws that were later deemed by the judicial system as disenfranchising minority voters. Since then, several other states have also enacted laws that restrict access to voting in ways that disproportionately impacts Black, Asian, Latino, and Indigenous voters. Without a means of enforcement, legal protections have no power. Nowhere is this more evident than in Lewis's home state of Georgia, where on a single night in July of 2017, more than 500,000 of the state's 6.6 million registered voters were purged from the rolls, many simply because they hadn't voted in the prior few elections. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act introduces new mechanisms for the enforcement of voting rights, redefining the circumstances under which preclearance is required and targeting practices that have a history of leading to racial discrimination. The bill is bipartisan, but just barely. It's supported by all of the Senate's Democrats, its 2 independents, and Republican Lisa Murkowski. It's unlikely to make it out of committee, let alone be passed and then signed into law under the current administration. Letting proposed legislation languish in committee isn't anything new. It's routinely done by members of both parties. The current hindrance of efforts to correct the long-standing social ill of disenfranchising U.S. citizens based on their race is a particularly vivid demonstration of a truth Lewis expressed at the March on Washington in 1963. American politics is dominated by politicians who build their careers on immoral compromises and ally themselves with open forms of political, economic, and social exploitation, he said. If the bill is doomed to fail, why advocate for it? Because unlikely goals are still worth fighting for. And as Lewis repeatedly said, the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democracy. We're limping right now, but we're also blessed. Blessed by legacies like the ones given to us in John Lewis, and the opportunities we have to make our communities, the nation, and our world safer, more just, and equitable. May we brave these places, because God is in them, ever ready to meet us. May we prevail over them each time the night fades and the sun rises. And may we know that our aches will be the testaments to what will become our joy. Thanks be to God. Amen.